think about how we might connect together some of the themes that have emerged through this. And I was sort of writing down various words along the way. The first word that I clocked from everything that's been said over the last few hours was about purpose. Purpose is really important. So I want to remind us of what the purpose is of why we are here today. And the purpose of being here today was about saying, how do we move from having a collection of bright spots to having a bright system? And we're translating that as how do we go from a situation of isolated examples to system-wide transformation. So that's a really important bit, and I've heard on this, it's been great being on this table. We've got two fantastic principals here with two fantastic schools, so I'm going to come back to those, John and Tony. So, you know, I can hear the bright spots, but it's how do we get from those bright spots and the many other bright spots to a bright system. The second big word I keep hearing is about, and it came back with Jodie and Melissa talking, is about learning. We need to be about learning. And there is 50 years of research and learning about innovation and diffusion. So we shouldn't think that we in education have to reinvent the wheel. We should learn from the experience in other sectors, other industries, other countries about what works in terms of innovation and diffusion, of taking bright spots and making them into bright systems. And then thirdly, which I want to come back to a number of times, is about evidence. And what we might mean by evidence in this and the place of evidence in this process. So I'm going to do all that in now 9 and a bit minutes, Tony. Okay, so we have to ask ourselves the question, why we're even here? Not the purpose, but why do we bother to have this session at all about bright spots to bright systems? Is because we know that at the moment the bright spots don't add up to the bright system. We know that innovations and great practice in education, in early years, in health, in transport, in community safety, and a whole number of other sectors, tends to stay, sort of as a colleague of mine used to say, locked on location. So we have to understand why the examples we have don't go to scale. And we had a great presentation earlier on from Susie and Simon about some of the behavioural barriers and some of the belief barriers. Shows I read the thing, very good. Behavioural and belief barriers. But what I want to do is to try and pick that up through what I think are 5 myths. There are 5 basic reasons why the methods that we've used in the past won't work. And that's evidenced. It's evidence not just within education, because that's why we're here, but in other sectors as well. So I want to spend just a little time on these 5 myths, and then say something that we know from learning and evidence works in other sectors and other countries and other places about how we scale up. So I'm going to take these 5 myths. And each one of them, in my experience, people go, oh, well, no, you mean that's wrong rather than that's right, right? So we tend to think that, and I don't need to dwell too far on the first one, we tend to think that scaling and adoption and diffusion and spread are issues about evidence. And what we heard from Susie and Simon is, and we can show it in study after study over 50 years, is it's not evidence that leads to scaling and diffusion. Evidence might be necessary, but having evidence does not guarantee in any way that a practice, a model, a service will scale. So it's not just about evidence and information. And we know it. I mean, you know, for people, we've had examples, but you can take them all about lifestyle changes and about all sorts of things. But the evidence is overwhelming that people carry on doing. Actually, not just because of beliefs, but also because of powerful vested interests that they have. Powerful vested interests. We might come back to that. Secondly, we believe our fundamental assumption is that innovations, great practices, spread through transferring from one organisation to another, from one school to another, from one hospital to another, from one police station to another. The evidence over 50 years of study after study is that if we're talking about radical and transformative practices that change relationships, they don't move through transfer from one organisation to another. They often more occur through the innovative organisation displacing other organisations and growing and scaling of themselves. And interesting, having a great discussion, if I can see we're about Good Start now, Good Start moves and how you get great practices in early years provision. It isn't just it transfers off to another, it grows as an organisation, it grows in scale, it grows in its network and so forth. So again, I was intrigued that talking to Tony and John on this table, the way in which those practices are evolving are through networks, growing together, sharing, collaborating in practice development. It's really critical. Thirdly, we tend to go, how many people have heard the expression pilots? We're going to do pilots and then we're going to roll them out, yeah? Right? Pilots and then roll out. It's a mantra of governments around the world. We're going to do a series of pilots, we'll get them right, then we'll roll them out. So we think innovation is one bit and diffusion and scaling is another, a separate and sequential process. All the evidence from sector after sector, country after country, is the way in which practices scale is by not treating these as separate processes, but by thinking about how do you scale and grow right from the beginning of the practice. How do you do it in a way that engages people in a large-scale way? We've got lots of examples that we've heard of in the room. How do we begin to do that in a way that doesn't separate out these processes, but has this disciplined innovation at the start? And I want to pause just here about evidence. I believe, as I've said before in other sessions, that evidence is critical in the disciplines innovation process. Absolutely critical, but only in particular stages. So I want to take you on a little journey for a moment, which is Thomas Edison, who was one of the inventors of the light bulb. And I want you to imagine that Thomas Edison, who shall I pick on? Thomas Edison was, let's assume for a moment that he lived in Victoria, and that he was going to go to the Innovations Committee of the Department of Education and Early Childhood Development in Victoria. Yeah? So Thomas Edison has invented the light bulb. There he is, he's sitting there. He tries to do it. He creates this little filament. It's a really critical part of it. This tiny little filament. It took him days and days and days to do it. And he would take this little filament along to the committee of the Department of Education and Early Childhood Development in Victoria, and he'd put on the table very proudly, as he did many times, and he'd press the switch, and the filament broke. And most departments of Education, Early Childhood Development, Innovations Committee would say at that point, rubbish. No good, right? Where's the evidence for that? It's broken, it doesn't work. And we wouldn't have light bulbs. It took Thomas Edison hundreds of times to get the filament of the light bulb right. So at the early stages of developing practice, we have to be on a learning journey, a process of prototyping and development that acknowledges that things never, radical innovations never work first time. But the evidence comes in at a point where we have developed a design that we think has some really powerful impacts. But if we think that we can drive an innovation process through evidence, we'll find that we block off anything that's radical. I remember well sitting down with a group of ministers where people were proposing a very innovative policy that was new in the world. And the ministers said, what's the evidence for it? And he said, it's new. Right? It's new. But what that means, as Kevin has said, that we have to have a very disciplined innovation process that allows us to build the evidence about whether something works or not. It's a cumulative, organic, and iterative process. So that's myth 3. Myth 4. Myth 4. I like this one, actually, because lots of politicians love this one, which is the sort of notion that they get really frustrated at how little of these things actually scale and spread. So they say, well, let's just do more innovations, right? And if you think I'm joking, and just have a look at most government innovation strategies around the world, because they are all about supply side on this. They're about generating more and more and more innovations in the sort of hope that they will stick. And if you're an economist by background, you'll know the problem with this approach is that it pays attention to the supply side but not the demand side. Yeah. What is it that would convert What would convert people into being, as it were, passive recipients of a new practice, into people who are active demanders, active consumers, active buyers, active purchasers? I don't care what word we use in this, but paying attention to the demand side is really important. It's interesting in this that governments, sorry, it's a little plug, 2002-3, Jeff Mulgan and I, when we were in the strategy unit in the UK, wrote a paper about innovation in the public sector. It was the easiest review we ever did of anything in the strategy review, because nothing was written about innovation in the public sector in 2003. We celebrate the innovator. We don't celebrate the people who are the adopters, the people who take on those, who copy and adapt and transfer the innovations into their own organisations. We celebrate the origins, but not the adapters. So we've got to pay more attention to the demand side. And fifth, and perhaps most contentious, is the notion that professionals are the key agents of diffusion. That it's professionals. We've had lots of discussion. It's fantastic that we've got teachers in the room. But if we look at how really powerful innovations really take root and go to scale, it's about mobilizing the demand of the users, of, in our case, the students, the parents, the communities, and the employers, who are saying, it is not good enough that we have the practices that we have now, that we need these new practices. So reaching out to the users, the consumers, the parents, the communities, is really important as a way of driving this. So there are all these myths, right? These myths. So if we just focus on evidence and information, if we just think it's about transfer, if we think that scaling is the process after innovation, and if we think that we just pump up more innovations and we just rely on teachers, we will get exactly what we've got already, which is lots of interesting examples, lots of bright spots, but no bright systems. So I just want to conclude, therefore, by indicating that three approaches that are emerging in education, that are tried and tested and evidenced in other sectors, which may provide us with a better understanding of how we can move from bright spots to bright systems. So I'm going to talk, one, about organic growth very briefly, secondly, about mobilizing demand, and thirdly, about enabling conditions. And we can go to, and this is a bit complex, but actually you all know it. This just starts off by saying it's about growth. Several people have used the word growth. I prefer the word growth to scaling or diffusion or any of these other things. How do we grow? How do we grow communities of people? How do we engage the collaborative practices beyond schools? What we hear in Singapore, the lesson I hear each time is, out of the many lessons, is this way of creating big, collaborative, growing communities that reach out, that are ever expanding, that start with a community of people developing a practice, if you like, the innovators, but connect all the way through with the people who are the potential adopters. These are the people. The problem at the moment is, we've heard this before, is that they're, try and do an Australian example, I always get lost here. Kevin did Warwickshire and somewhere, but let's take in Australia. People go, okay, so the terrible problem is at the moment that, that might work in Sydney, but it wouldn't work in far north Queensland, or more like, it might work in Perth, but forget about it in Victoria, right?
Yeah, well, that'd be true.
That would be true, yeah. And the reason for that is, of course, that people are right in some senses. They are right that all these practices and relationships and models need some form of adaptation in order to work in a different context. So if you just separate off the innovators from the potential adopters, they are right to say, well, it might have worked in Sydney or Perth, but it wouldn't work in our place. So what we've got to find is a way of organically connecting the potential adopters, the people who might take on these new practices, with the process of developing the innovation themselves. And then thirdly, there's a bundle of people who are a bit more sceptical, not really ready to adopt yet, and we've got to find ways of keeping them engaged around different forms of newsletters and social media and so on. And all the time we're trying to recruit from our community of interest into our community of engagement, into our community of practice. Okay, so, and some people around the world, thing about all these things is some of these diagrams stick and make sense to people and help them, and others don't. And you can find iterations of this diagram littered around the world. Some people like to refer to it as the egg diagram and so forth. Perhaps one of the greatest elaborations of this was in the New York City Innovation Zone. Started off in here, there was about 25 schools at the beginning, and about 1,600 odd sort of out dispersed here. Now we've got about 250 in this, and about another 300 here, and so on. Okay, so organic growth. Why do I like organic growth? What do you need for organic growth? And for this bit, I rely entirely on my mother-in-law for this piece, because I'm not a gardener. You need to nurture it. You need to fertilize it. You need to prune. You need to be able to have some idea of design. This isn't an accidental process. It doesn't just grow. So what agencies have to do is create the conditions that, in a sense, support and nurture and foster these networks, these communities to grow. Second, I just mentioned this before, this is about mobilizing demand. Some of the great innovations, great transformations, great practices grow, change through building a sort of social movement around it. And those have four really critical elements to it. One about the compelling case for change, which was in there, although you had a slightly different word than compelling, I can't remember why, but there was a different word in there. Most of the cases, I was asked recently, I was working with a health system not too far away from here, and they said, no, we've got a really compelling case for change. And I said, what's that? And they brought in this sort of box of papers like this, and they dumped it down there, and I read through some of them. I thought it is really sort of compelling on a rational level, but does it create passion and urgency in the people in the system to really feel they want to move? No, because no one's going to wade through it. So it's about something that's compelling in content and format. Always had some sort of inspiring, guiding vision. Again, I refer to Singapore. Just listen to those words about what the Singaporean education system is about, that inspires and guides teachers on a journey through this. And then they have ways, we should have ways of connecting users, sorry, it says citizens, so don't worry about it, users and professional networks, students and teachers I've talked about, and having different ways for people to engage. And finally, very quickly, particularly for the policy people in the audience, the third thing that we know makes a real difference to scaling is around creating the right enabling conditions for this. What are the rewards and recognitions? And these need not be financial in any way. They can be developmental, promotional, status, whatever it might be, opportunities that really encourage people to scale, to spread and develop and so forth. So we've heard talk about networks and chains and so forth of schools. Part of the work that I and colleagues did was about how do you create enabling legislation. We created legislation in the UK in 2005 that looked like it didn't demand anybody did anything. It just enabled new structures and a few incentives to be created that enabled the formation of networks and chains and trusts and federations, all sorts of words, that would enable the schools, in a sense, to grow their capacity, to grow scale, to occupy more sense of that sector and so forth. So there's a whole set of things around regulation, recognition and reward. So my imploring, and we'll hear some more about other sectors, is that we think really carefully when you take a particular practice you want to scale, which has the evidence that we know in order for it to scale, which of the three approaches is most important, most relevant to those particular practices. And I can share some slides later on, which, not in session here, which identify what sorts of practices are best for what sorts of approaches to scaling and diffusion. But that's an attempt to map some of that territory.